I need to be upfront about something before I get into this. I am a person who does his research. I am not impulsive. I am not credulous. I do not make major decisions without information. When I rent a place to live, I read the lease carefully. I do a walkthrough. I ask questions. I mention this because what I'm about to describe involves a failure of due diligence on my part that I still can't entirely account for, a gap in my usual caution that I've spent years trying to understand and that I've eventually concluded may not have been accidental. The room came up when I was in a bind. I'd been living in a shared house that was being sold, and I had about 3 weeks to find somewhere new, which is a tight timeline in a city with a competitive rental market. I was looking at everything, ads on every platform, word of mouth, bulletin boards, the whole range. The listing for the room on Hennessy Street appeared on a site I used infrequently, one of the older classified type platforms that was a little clunkier than the others, and the listing was sparse. A photograph of the exterior of a house, a brief description, a monthly rate that was well below market, and a phone number. I called the number. A man answered. His voice was older, warm, the voice of someone who had been doing things at their own pace for a long time and saw no reason to change that. He said his name was Mr. Aldous. He described the room, second floor of his house, private bathroom, use of the kitchen, quiet street, good light in the mornings. He said he preferred a tenant who was tidy and kept regular hours and didn't have parties. I said that described me accurately. He said, "Good, come and have a look." I went the next day. The house was a narrow 3-story Victorian on a residential street that had been developed in the late 19th century and that had a dignified, slightly faded quality. The houses well built and individual, the street lined with mature trees, the sidewalks the old irregular brick kind that heave and settle over decades. Mr. Aldous's house was mid-block, dark green with cream trim, a small front garden that was tidy without being fussy. He answered the door when I knocked. He was exactly what his voice had suggested. An older man, I'd put him in his late 70s, trim and upright with the posture of someone who had kept themselves in order. White hair, a cardigan, the particular unhurried quality of a person who had long since stopped performing urgency. He shook my hand and showed me the room. The room was on the 2nd floor at the front of the house with 2 windows that faced the street and let in the morning light he'd described. Hardwood floors, a good-sized closet, the private bathroom across the hall, furnished simply with things that were old but solid. A bed, a desk, a dresser, a reading chair by the window. Clean, quiet, the kind of room that felt like it had been a reading room and a sleeping room for a long time and was good at both. I said I'd take it. We went back downstairs to his sitting room, which was the kind of sitting room that accumulates over a long life. Bookshelves covering most of one wall, a fireplace with a good mantel, furniture that had been chosen for comfort rather than style and had delivered on that promise for decades. He made tea without asking whether I wanted any, which I found I didn't mind. We sat and went over the terms. He was clear and specific about what he expected from a tenant: tidiness, regular hours, consideration for the shared spaces, and he was easy about everything else. We agreed on a month-to-month arrangement. He gave me a key. I moved in on a Saturday. He was there when I arrived, helped me carry a few boxes without being asked, showed me where things were in the kitchen and where I could put my bike in the back passage. He made a comment about the street that told me he'd been on it for a long time, knew its rhythms and its history. He pointed out which neighbors had dogs and which had the kind of garden worth noticing in spring. I lived in that house for 4 months, and I want to tell you about those 4 months because they were, in the most ordinary and genuine sense, some of the most comfortable months I've spent anywhere. Mr. Stripe Aldous was a good landlord in the truest meaning of that. He maintained the place, fixed things when they needed fixing, was present without being intrusive, respected my hours and my privacy completely. We'd exchange a few words when our paths crossed in the kitchen or the hallway. Brief, easy conversations about the weather or what was going on in the neighborhood, or occasionally a book we'd both read, because he noticed what I was reading and had opinions about it. Not imposing opinions, just the opinions of someone who had read a great deal over a long life and found it natural to discuss. He was, in short, an excellent companion in a house. The kind of person whose presence raises the quality of the atmosphere of a place without your ever being able to point to exactly how. I was happy there. I want to say that clearly because it matters to the story. I was genuinely, simply happy in that house in a way I hadn't been in several of the places I'd lived before it. The conversation that changed things happened at work, not at the house. I was talking with a colleague about my neighborhood, mentioning the street I was on, and she said she knew that street, had a friend who'd lived nearby a few years back. We talked about the area for a bit, and then she mentioned offhandedly that she remembered a house on that block that had been in some small local news story a couple of years prior. Something about an elderly man who had died in the house and whose estate had taken some time to settle because the family situation was complicated. I asked which house. She described the exterior, dark green with cream trim. I sat with that for a moment. I said, "Do you remember the man's name?" She didn't. She said it had been a brief thing, a neighborhood notice kind of story, nothing detailed. I said I thought I knew the house, and I'd look into it. I said it as casually as I could, which was not very casually because something had shifted in my chest in the way things shift when information arrives that overloads your existing framework. I looked it up that evening. It took some searching. The kind of local news item my colleague had described wasn't always indexed well, but I found it. A brief piece in a neighborhood publication from about 2 years before my tenancy began. An elderly man had been found by a neighbor in his house on Hennessy Street. The name in the article was Aldous. I read the article twice. Then I sat at my desk in the second-floor room with the good morning light, and I looked at the room around me. The old solid furniture, the bookshelves I'd added my own books to, the reading chair by the window that I had spent many evenings in. I thought about the man downstairs who made tea without asking and had opinions about books and pointed out which neighbors had dogs. I thought about how I had never in 4 months asked him anything substantive about himself. I had not asked him how long he'd lived there, or whether he had family, or what he'd done before he retired. We had talked about books and the neighborhood and the weather. We had not talked about him in any way that would have given me information I could verify. I thought about the lease. I got it out, and it was a standard month-to-month document, signed by both parties, his signature clear and old-fashioned. I had his signature. I had it on paper. I had a physical document signed by a man whose name appeared in an obituary notice from 2 years before I'd met him. I did not go downstairs that night. I want to be honest about that. I lay in bed for a long time thinking about the situation I appeared to be in, trying to decide how to hold it, and at some point I fell asleep the way you fall asleep when your mind has been going hard enough that it eventually just stops. In the morning I went downstairs and Mr. Aldous was in the kitchen making coffee. He turned when I came in and said good morning with the same warmth as every other morning and asked how I'd slept. I sat down at the kitchen table and I said, "I need to ask you something." He set down the coffee and sat across from me and gave me his full attention, the way he gave things his full attention, unhurried and complete. I said, "I read something last night about this house and about a man named Aldous who died here about 2 years ago." He was quiet for a moment, not surprised, the same quality that my grandmother had when I asked about June, the same quality that the front desk clerk had when I asked about the elevator, the quality of someone who has been waiting for a question and is now deciding how to answer it. He said, "I wondered when you'd get there." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "It means that most people don't. Most people don't look and don't ask, and we just have the time we have and then they move on and that's fine." He said, "You were always more likely than most to eventually look." I said, "What are you?" He thought about this in the particular way he thought about things that deserve careful thought. Then he said, "I'm what I've always been, a man who lived in this house for 40 years and who found, when it came time to go, that he wasn't quite ready to leave it." He paused. "I've been here for the new people when new people came. Not all of them noticed me." "You always seem to." I said, "Why me?" He said he wasn't sure exactly. He said some people were more permeable to certain things than others, more open to what was available, less committed to the inventory of what was supposed to be possible. He said he'd known from the first phone call that I was going to be someone worth having in the house for a while. He said I was welcome to stay or to go, that he understood entirely if I wanted to go, that there was nothing required of me either way. I stayed for another 3 months. I want to tell you that too, that I considered it and chose it because I think it matters. I stayed and we had 3 more months of morning conversations in the kitchen and comments about books in the hallway and quiet evenings in our separate parts of the house. It was not frightening. It was not strange in the way strangeness usually means. It was simply a house with a man in it who was very comfortable with the house and who had decided to stay on. I left in the spring when a different situation opened up that made sense for where my life was going. I packed my things on a Saturday, the same day of the week I'd arrived. Mr. Aldous was there when I carried the last boxes down. He shook my hand at the door, the same firm handshake as the first day. He said it had been a pleasure to have me. I said it had been a genuine pleasure to be there. I meant it completely. I walked to my car and I put the last box in, and I turned around and looked at the dark green house with cream trim and the front garden tidy, without being fussy, and the second-floor windows catching the morning light. And I thought about a man who had lived there for 40 years and who had found that the living was not quite done when the life technically ended. I find that the least frightening thing I've ever contemplated, a man who loved his house, who had built 40 years of himself into its walls and floors, and the particular quality of its mornings, who was not ready to let it go, and found that he didn't have to, who made tea and talked about books and pointed out the neighbors' dogs and gave a good room at a below-market rate to the occasional person who was permeable enough to receive what he was offering. I think about him sometimes when I'm somewhere that doesn't feel quite right, when the apartment is too new or too neutral or too much like every other apartment, and I think about what it would mean to spend 40 years somewhere and give it that much of yourself, enough that the self persists in the giving. I hope he's still there. I hope someone else is in the second-floor room with the good morning light, someone permeable enough to say good morning back and mean it. I hope the tea is good. Sleep well tonight. Some houses hold their people. Some people hold their houses. The love that goes into a place over years does not simply stop when the years do. It stays. It makes tea in the morning. Good night.